Come now, Alice. It's only a dream.
It's not a dream, it's a memory. And it makes me sick.
Now, focus. Wait. You're floating again. Weightless. A cipher. Relax.
I'm in hell.
Forget it. Abandon that memory. It's unproductive. Go to Wonderland.
I can't. I'm trapped. In my past.
Sergeant, this girl's badly burned. Call for a doctor!
She'll be alright.
No, Alice. Discard that delusion. Forget it. Go to Wonderland.
There are few stories in literary history as universally recognizable as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. The story of a curious girl falling down a rabbit hole and into a whimsical, nonsensical world has inspired countless adaptations, with the most prominent one being Disney's version of Alice in Wonderland. But American McGee's Alice and its sequel Alice Madness Returns take a darker path. These games reconstruct Wonderland not as a whimsical escape, but as a Gothic manifestation of a fractured mind, an introspective battleground for trauma, guilt, and madness absolute. Far from the innocent charm of the original story or Disney's sanitized adaptation, this game brutally plunges headfirst into a nightmarish reimagining of Alice's Wonderland, which is now a dark and wicked reflection of her damaged mental state, a place where all things that go bump for Alice collide. Institutionalized in the grim halls of Rutledge Asylum and now under the quote-unquote care of Dr.Angus Bumby, Alice has to reconcile her traumatic past with her tenuous present. As you go through the game, you peel back the layers of Alice Liddell's broken mind. Each level is a fractal of her past traumas and her journey through the 5 stages of grief. The characters you meet in Wonderland are ones you will recognize from the beloved book and the Disney movies, but now they are eerie, twisted versions of themselves, and every encounter pushes Alice to face the painful truths that she's been running from or has been forced to run away from. The game masterfully intertwines gameplay with psychological themes, using Wonderland as both a battleground and a sanctuary for Alice's mind. It is wild that Madness Returns isn't more recognized as one of the most ambitious explorations of trauma and mental health in gaming. How do trauma and mental illness shape Wonderland's evolution, or de-evolution? What is Wonderland exactly? What do its characters reveal about Alice's splintering psyche? And how does her journey mirror the Victorian Society that failed to understand her? My video essay will go beyond and attempt to understand Alice, uncovering her complexities and what makes her so intriguing. Drawing from in-game storytelling, historical context, and real-world psychological theories, as we normally do on this channel, we'll dissect how concepts such as survivor's guilt, dissociation, and Victorian medicine are woven into Alice's journey, and how the game reinterprets Carroll's original Wonderland through the lens of trauma recovery and self-acceptance. So, welcome to the maddening psychology of
Alice, Madness Returns.
Major spoilers and uncomfortable topics as we jump down the rabbit hole. And if you enjoy deep dives into these complex characters and the themes they explore, subscribe. Also, you are more than welcome to like the video if you're insane enough to join the Tea Party. After all,
We're all mad here.
in the year 2000, the same year I entered first grade, but about 2 decades before I met my wife, American McGee's Alice introduced us to a version of Wonderland unlike anything seen before, a world twisted by the fragmented psyche of Alice Liddell. It was a groundbreaking reimagining of Lewis Carroll's story, transforming Wonderland into a warped reflection of Alice's trauma. But, interestingly enough, Alice Liddell wasn't only a fictional creation, she was a real person who inspired Lewis's literary works. Carroll, whose real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, was a mathematician, logician, and a family friend of the Liddells. Born on May 4, 1852, Alice Liddell was the fourth child out of 10, growing up in an environment of privileged academia. She met Dodgson in 1856 when he befriended the Liddell family. He often entertained the Liddell children with whimsical stories, and it was during a fateful boating trip on the River Thames that Alice was enchanted by one of his imaginative tales. She urged him to write it down, which ultimately would become the foundation for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a literary work that has captivated audiences for generations, the same one that we know today. The real Alice, like her fictional counterpart, was curious, imaginative, but Alice's real life was far from magical. She married, had 3 sons, 2 of which were killed during World War I, and then later her husband would pass away, leaving her to face profound loss and hardship alone. She died in 1934. These struggles echo the themes of resilience and trauma seen in American McGee's Alice and Alice Madness Returns. That's the first and the second game, where the fictional Alice navigates a Wonderland reshaped by tragedy. But that's not all. There's a little bit of controversy. You see, Lewis Carroll's relationship with Alice and his behavior raise difficult questions, because besides being an author, Dodgson was a keen photographer who focused much of his work on children, including Alice and her siblings. Some of his photos, considered artistic in the Victorian era, depicted young girls in varying states of dress. By modern standards, these images are troubling and raise serious ethical concerns. Historians disagree on Carroll's intentions. Some argue that his fascination with children reflected Victorian ideals that celebrated childhood innocence, but others suggest more disturbing motives, pointing to his sudden disinterest in friendships with young girls after they reached adolescence, and just the overall intimate nature of his photography. However, his relationship with the Liddell family ended abruptly in 1863, and some believe it was due to an inappropriate attachment that he may have formed towards Alice or another family member, a concept we're going to talk about soon and see reflected in the game. However, with much of his personal letters and diaries destroyed, there is no clear evidence, leaving his actions and legacy surrounded by uncertainty. Despite these controversies, the connection between Alice and Dodgson produced one of literature's most enduring works. But in the video game, Wonderland's become something darker, a reflection of the scars left by a tragedy. This reimagining obscures the boundaries between fantasy and reality, showing how stories can transform and evolve to reflect deeper truths about the human experience. There are actually 2 games in American McGee's series, with unfortunately a third cancelled one that we will never experience. The first game, American McGee's Alice, was a PC game. From way back then when you used to have to put CDs into the computers, you can't find the first game on Steam. But you don't actually need to play the first game to fully understand the story. However, I am going to give a synopsis here. On the 5th of November, 1863, Alice wakes up from a dream about Wonderland to a raging house fire. She escapes, but her parents and her sister Lizzie are killed, leaving her with some serious psychological damage. She's brought to a place called Rutledge Asylum, where several years of treatment fail to heal her. We also see that Alice often retreats mentally to Wonderland, which is now warped because of her trauma. At the heart of that game was a battle between Alice and the Queen of Hearts, culminating in the restoration of Wonderland and seemingly Alice's mind. At the end of the first game, Alice leaves Rutledge Asylum apparently healed, but appearances can be deceiving. The second game, and the focus of this video analysis, Alice Madness Returns, picks up where the first game left off 1 year later. Though Alice is no longer confined to Rutledge, her journey is far from over. If the first game was about overcoming immediate grief, this one dives deeper into guilt, memory, and the darker truths behind her psyche. Alice is now 19 years old, living in a Victorian orphanage called Houndsditch Home under the care of Dr. Bumby, a psychiatrist who specializes in helping children forget their trauma using hypnosis, an odd form of treatment, and that will come back around to haunt Alice throughout the game. Because the point of this game is Alice has to remember something in particular. She has to remember if she wants to heal. Right from the very start, Alice's trauma takes hold in horrifying ways, with vivid hallucinations and her unsettling shifts between the grim streets of Victorian London and the chaos of Wonderland. At the heart of her turmoil lies survivor's guilt, the cornerstone of her fractured psyche. This guilt seeps into every aspect of her journey, growing more insidious as her story unfolds. Survivor's guilt is the feeling that comes up when you survive a difficult or traumatic experience that others don't. This could be a disaster like a house fire or an accident, but it could actually also happen in situations like escaping emotional or psychological abuse. So, for an example, if you grew up in an abusive home and managed to leave, you might feel guilty knowing your siblings are still stuck in that harmful environment. It's a kind of profound and mostly irrational sense of responsibility that you take on, but the people who are affected by survivor's guilt often replay these events, even saying things like, "It should have been me." This emotionally charged torment can manifest in a myriad of other ways, which we will see with Alice as we go along. The term survivor's guilt was coined by American psychiatrist William G. Nederland in the 1960s when studying Holocaust survivors. He noticed that many of them experienced overwhelming guilt for having lived through the horrors that killed others. Nederland's work highlighted the unique psychological burden carried by survivors. And in Alice's case, her guilt is both the driving force and a barrier to her recovery. She believes she's responsible somehow for the fire that claimed her family, even though she has no concrete memory of how it started. This guilt leads her through a dangerous, confusing, and scary journey through her inner world, which is what we witness both in the first and second games. But in the first game, Alice confronts this guilt as a nebulous force. However, there's a twist. What she believes about that fire, what we thought from the first game, isn't actually the full story. There's a deeper, more sinister truth hidden beneath her memories, and this second game forces Alice to unearth it, and it gives us, the players, a deeper understanding of what actually went down and why. Survivor's guilt works in tandem with other conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, though that term wouldn't exist in Alice's era yet. Coined by American psychiatrists after World War I, the condition is as old as the trauma itself. PTSD happens when you experience an event so distressing that your mind struggles to process it, leading to intrusive memories, heightened anxiety, and avoidance behaviors. And so, when we look at Alice's case, the hallucinations and fractured memories we see are classic PTSD signs. She can't escape the fire, not in London, not in Wonderland. Even her most fantastical visions are tinged with ashes and flames, a constant reminder of the tragedy that she fully hasn't processed yet.
Still a mess, no surprise. Her kin roasted like chestnuts right before her eyes. 10 years in Rutledge Asylum wasted everyone's time. Dr. Bumby won't do better. Still hauling out her questions. The fire, her memory. I deserve consideration, don't I? Who found her new clothes? Who got her a place at Bumby's? Where'd she be without me? On the street, selling her backside. Likes my pigeons, though. She's doled out the odd pound or two. But what I know is worth more than that. Kept her secret, haven't I? Heard her say, "Oh, died on my account, I couldn't save you." I've told her my silence is for sale. Keep. I'm a good sort, really. Not like her nanny, that uppity whore, or that lawyer fellow Radcliffe took a stupid rabbit. Need money. Warned her I'd tell the coppers if she didn't make a donation to my upkeep. She yells and goes off her head. Days she can't remember her name, what I heard.
And this can actually amplify feelings of worthlessness, isolation, and depression. With Alice, it also magnifies her heightened vigilance, which you could actually see in the gameplay.
Need a drink. One mouse needs water.
Pretty birds, like you.
Go to Wonderland. It's only a dream.
Very upsetting journey, but I'm rid of Pris, or whatever she's become. At least the place I've landed is somewhat familiar.
About time, too, Alice.
Blasted cat. Don't try to bully me. I'm very much on edge.
Perfect. When you're not on edge, you're taking up too much space.
Her combat abilities, for an example, and her quick reactions suggest a mind that is always ready for danger even when none is present, a hallmark for PTSD. For Alice, this toxic soup of emotions seeps into every corner of her psyche, corrupting Wonderland into the dark thing that it is now. Her guilt becomes a living, breathing, nightmarish force symbolized by several elements in Wonderland, but most specifically, the Infernal Train. And her struggles are compounded by the society that she lives in. All of this, by the way, becomes evident within the first 10 minutes. We meet Dr. Bumby, we see her environment, the hallucinations and the restrictions, and the mentality of Victorian England. This era was not a kind time for those considered mad. Mental illness was poorly understood, often feared and stigmatized. Institutions such as Rutledge Asylum, where Alice was confined after the fire, were overcrowded and more focused on control than healing. And this would have added to her mental illness. At a critical time in her life, instead of receiving patient and proper care, she got isolated, sedated, and even lobotomized later in the game, and we'll actually see those memories later on. But then, enter Dr. Angus Bumby. On the surface, Bumby appears to be a progressive figure, offering care and shelter to orphans who have experienced horrible traumas. He uses hypnosis to help his patients forget their traumatic pasts, promising freedom from their pain. But there's something unsettling about his methods, because Bumby doesn't encourage healing or growth, he erases. His obsession with forgetting, with wiping slates clean, feels less like therapy and more like control. And as Alice's story unfolds, we'll see just how dangerous this approach can be and how insidious he really is. But first, we have to dive in to Wonderland. Alice's journey into Wonderland begins in a place that at first seems quite peaceful, exactly what you would expect Wonderland to look and feel like. This place she lands first is called the Vale of Tears, and it's lush. It's a floating valley with rivers, vibrant mushrooms, and flowers that seem to welcome her back. It's beautiful. But as with everything in Wonderland, there's something darker right under the surface. The Vale of Tears takes its name from a Christian phrase, Vale of Tears, referring to the struggles and suffering left behind as somebody journeys to a better place. In a religious context, that place would be heaven. For Alice, this veil might symbolize leaving behind her painful reality in London, the orphanage, the asylum, her guilt. Wonderland is supposed to be her sanctuary or her escape, but in this version of Wonderland, corrupted by her fractured mind, it is anything but heavenly. The first resident of Wonderland she meets is the Cheshire Cat. The cat has always been an enigmatic figure in Alice's adventures, and in Madness Returns, it becomes a representation of her inner wisdom. It nudges her towards self-discovery, offering cryptic guidance that forces her to confront truths that she would rather avoid. The kitty doesn't sugarcoat things, it lays out the rules of Wonderland, giving Alice practical advice for survival while subtly reminding her that she already has the strength she needs. For example, the Cheshire Cat introduces Alice to weapons and game mechanics like the iconic Vorpal Blade or the magic potion that can help her shrink and find secret pathways. And this is perfect because, of course, the peace of the Vale of Tears doesn't last too long. The first signs of corruption appear in the form of grotesque enemies like the insidious Ruin. These twisted creatures, greasy with mechanical slime, are unnatural invaders born of corruption. As Alice moves deeper into the Vale, the corruption becomes more obvious. At one point, she encounters a statue of herself, crying streams of black ooze. It perfectly showcases the duality of Wonderland, beautiful on the surface but corrupted underneath. And so the Vale of Tears represents the first stage of grief, denial. It's peaceful, beautiful, gorgeous, absolutely tranquil on the surface, but it masks so much horror underneath. Wonderland itself is a dissociating coping mechanism, which represents Alice's refusal to face the full weight of her pain. But that denial will come crashing down soon enough, because the Infernal Train will make her face truths that she's not ready for. The train barrels through Wonderland like an unstoppable force of destruction. It represents Alice's insanity, her train of thought, if you will. Self-created torment is a cruel paradox, and it's a way survivors of trauma try to regain control, but it often ends up deepening their wounds. Now for Alice, and for many in the real world, this torment manifests as extreme punishment, all rooted in the aftermath of trauma. After a traumatic event, survivors often feel disconnected from who they once were, saying things like, "I feel dead inside," or "I don't recognize myself anymore." And it's not just emotional, it's actually neurological. Trauma can throw off the brain's default mode network, or DMN, which is like the brain's autopilot for self-reflection, memories, and imagining the future. Now, normally the DMN kicks in when your mind is relaxed, like when you're daydreaming or thinking about your future. It helps you make sense of who you are and how your past connects to your present and future. When you focus on something like doing homework or playing a video game, the DMN takes a back seat, so your brain can concentrate. But trauma, especially in conditions like PTSD, disrupts this system. The DMN becomes disconnected, like a playlist that keeps skipping tracks, making it harder to feel grounded or connected to yourself. This can lead to feelings of alienation, as if you've lost touch with your sense of identity or your place in this world. So, when trauma becomes unbearable, survivors will often turn to self-created torment in order to cope. They might poke at an emotional wound by reliving every detail in their head, or they might berate themselves for not doing more in their hopeless situations. If you're a survivor of guilt, you might also put yourself in an unsafe or harmful situation, either consciously or unconsciously, because you view your punishment as a form of cosmic justice. This pattern is often seen in relationships where people who grew up in abusive or unstable environments unintentionally find themselves in similarly harmful dynamics as adults. If abuse or neglect was part of your early life, whether you watched it happen between your parents or if it happened to you, it can shape your understanding of what love and connection look like. familiarity feels safe, even if it's painful, so you might actually subconsciously gravitate towards relationships that mirror the dysfunction that you grew up with. This can create a tragic cycle where the person internalizes the belief that they deserve mistreatment or that they can't escape it, reinforcing feelings of unworthiness or helplessness. Breaking free from this pattern requires more than simply recognizing it. It involves healing the deeper wounds, actively going out of your way to heal those wounds that made it feel inevitable for you in the first place. In Alice's case, the black ooze, the Infernal Train, and her distorted enemies all represent ways in which her mind punishes her for surviving the fire that killed her family, and her sessions with Dr. Bumby aren't helping. In fact, if anything, they're making it worse. But before we learn how, we need to explore the second stage of grief, anger.
Appearances, as you know better than most, can be deceiving, Alice. Much has changed since your last visit.
Dr. Bumby says change is constructive, that different is good.
Different denotes neither bad nor good, but it certainly means not the same. Find the Hatter, Alice. He knows more about different than you.
But does he know more about the difference between bad and good?
Making friends, Alice. You're as randomly lethal and entirely confused as you ever were.
I've managed without you so far, Cat. Return to whatever hovels home to you. I'll call if I need you.
Predictably rash. It's not a question of if, Alice, it's when. Now hold on, and as they say, shut up.
So typical.
And so, we go from the lush greenery and beautiful landscapes of the Vale of Tears to the industrial, mechanical, metal wasteland of Hatter's domain. Everything here is harsh and disjointed, a chaotic reflection of Alice's mental. Here, we see the gameplay mechanic that is both fascinating and disturbing, called Hysteria mode. This mode grants Alice invincibility for a short time, making all of her weapons more powerful as well. It activates when you're on your last rose of health, and it triggers with a blood-curdling scream, followed by the world turning black and white and Alice's eyes bleeding. Quite literally, Hysteria mode is when Alice is at her breaking point, where her anger, pain, and determination explode in a violent surge. The bleeding eyes in Monochromatic World showcase the rawness of her emotions, showing us that she's been pushed to her absolute limits. It's a state of survival, terrifying, unhinged, and unstoppable. In many ways, this is Alice taking control of her own chaos, using it as a weapon to confront her enemies, both external and internal. The term hysteria carries a dark and troubling history, particularly in Victorian England, where it was often used as a catch-all diagnosis to pathologize women's emotions and behaviors. At a time when societal norms demanded women remain passive and submissive, if you, a woman, had any display of anger, frustration, sadness, or even independence, you were labeled hysterical. This diagnosis served as a tool to silence and control women, reinforcing the patriarchal structures that denied them agency. Rooted in ancient Greek medicine, hysteria was believed to result from a dysfunction of the uterus, an idea that lingered into the 19th century. It was frequently applied to women experiencing anxiety, depression, or unexplained physical symptoms, and treatments were often degrading and ineffective, ranging from enforced rest and isolation to institutionalization. These practices not only ignored the underlying causes of distress, but also perpetuated the stigma surrounding women's mental health. Modern psychology has abandoned the term hysteria, recognizing it as outdated and sexist. And today, many of the symptoms once attributed to hysteria are more accurately understood within the frameworks of anxiety disorders, trauma responses, or somatic symptom disorders, reflecting a more compassionate and evidence-based approach to mental health. Alice's experience mirrors this history in many ways. Her anger, her trauma are all dismissed as madness. So now she transforms it into a symbol of power. In this mode, Alice isn't fragile or broken, she is ferocious. She carries this ferocity throughout the stage as she helps Mad Hatter retrieve his limbs.
No. Wake! No. Bad dream. A blasted good night.
Hatter, I recall leaving you in a decrepit condition. But
What?
not in pieces.
Oh, it's you.
What's happened here? You've lost your hat, and some parts are missing.
Missing indeed, though things being what they are. I barely missed their missing. As to what's happened, you should know that better than I. It's your place after all. I know my place.
When did you ever know your place, or how to keep it? Now what's going on?
That's going on. The world is upside down, Alice. Inmates run the asylum. No thanks. And worst of all, I'm left tealess.
Tragic. If I do help, will you help me in return?
Cross my heart if I had one. Find my limbs and toss them into the chute. Machines will do the rest. Be on your way now, that's a good girl. Best way out is through the croc face.
Mr. Hatter himself is a pitiful figure, literally torn apart by his former friends, the March Hare and Dormouse. And this image of the Hatter is not unlike Alice's own mental state, dismembered and disorganized. But she helps him retrieve his limbs and piece him back together, in the same way that she wants to put herself back together, even as the anger clouds her judgment and vision. And yet, the Hatter would still refuse to give Alice the straight answers she wants. He just jibber-jabbers nonsense and speaks in riddles, which infuriates Alice even further. But when the March Hare and the Dormouse appear and threaten Alice's progress, the Hatter goes berserk and attacks them both. His sudden rage stems from two things: his friends releasing the Infernal Train and their betrayal of Alice. And it seems odd that Hatter, who in the first game was unwilling to help and would actually fight Alice for a good chunk of that game, took such a step. But fascinatingly enough, Survivor's Guilt often creates strange and contradictory emotional landscapes. People who carry guilt have to deal with self-hatred and feelings of unworthiness, but despite this internal turmoil, there's also an instinctive drive to survive. In this moment, the Hatter's protective instincts take over, proving that even the most chaotic, bitter, and angry parts of Alice are still fighting for her survival. The Hatter represents the bitter, broken, and angry part of Alice, a mess of conflicting emotions, but when faced with a direct threat, self-preservation kicks in. The Hatter's act, while violent, also reflects a critical step in Alice's journey. It's a cathartic release of anger, a recognition that some parts of her mind, like the betrayal of March Hare and Dormouse, must be destroyed for her to make any meaningful progress. As the Hatter's domain collapses, Alice wakes up in the real world, pulled from the River Thames by the sailors. This brief interlude into Victorian England reminds us that there is a whole other world, the real world, that Alice is completely disconnected from. And she has to fix Wonderland if she truly wants to be grounded in this reality. Not that this reality is any better.
Saints be praised that he works in mysterious ways. Got plans for her.
Take her over to the Mangled Mermaid. Rent a bed.
Hard to woo a girl mixed abroad.
The Mangled Mermaid is a filthy tavern, and it acts as a tiny glimpse into the brutal reality of the world that women faced in Victorian England. As for many women, especially those without family, money, or status, there were very few choices. Girls who found themselves orphaned, like Alice, were pushed to the edges of society and forced to use their bodies as currency in order to stay alive. Even when women managed to earn money for themselves, whether it was through factory work or sex work, they rarely got to keep it. Pimps, landlords, and self-proclaimed protectors would step in and take whatever they could, stripping these women of what little control they had over their lives. And refusing them wasn't an option either, because disobedience was met with threats, violence, or worse. Again, it's another part of an entire system designed to keep women powerless and dependent. And the game makes no effort to sugarcoat this reality. Women, especially in the slums, were seen as disposable, objects left with no rights, no opportunities, and no way out. And when Alice stands up for one of the women in The Mangled Mermaid, she gets knocked out.
Share my feelings.
Out like a snuff candle. Sleeps.
And as she goes unconscious, once more surrounded by blazing fire, we leave the dark, fractured society of Victorian England and helldive into the dark, frozen world of Wonderland, but this time in a new region, Tundraful. Tundraful is a desolate, frozen wasteland, but it marks a shift in Alice's journey. Here, she encounters characters like the Mock Turtle and the Carpenter, whose quests symbolize the next stage of grief, bargaining. Each of these characters asks Alice for help, offering promises of guidance or salvation in return, bargaining with her. The Mock Turtle, now a ship's admiral, recounts his former job as a station master on the Looking Glass line, telling Alice how the Infernal Train disrupted Wonderland's delicate balance. Meanwhile, the Carpenter enlists Alice into another series of increasingly frustrating errands. In Alice Madness Returns, the Walrus and the Carpenter are portrayed as twisted versions of their literary counterparts, embodying themes of exploitation and corruption in Alice's disturbed mind. After she completes her tasks, the Carpenter and Walrus enact their grotesque and dark play, highlighting their roles as manipulators and consumers of innocence. The Walrus eats everyone during the play as a representation of gluttony and indulgence. His actions symbolize the destructive nature of unchecked appetite, both literal and metaphorical. The play itself is a twisted performance orchestrated by the Carpenter, with the Walrus as his partner in crime. The Carpenter lures the unsuspecting sea creatures to participate in the play, promising them entertainment and purpose. However, it's all a facade, as the true purpose is to satisfy the Walrus's insatiable hunger. This scene reflects Alice's perception of manipulation and betrayal in her own life. The Walrus's consumption of the innocent sea creatures can be seen as a metaphor for how innocent individuals are exploited and consumed by more powerful, selfless entities. It also highlights the idea of false promises and the dangers of being led astray by those who seem trustworthy but have hidden, harmful intentions. In Alice's mind, the actions of the Walrus and the Carpenter serve as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of greed and the ease with which innocence can be devoured by deceitful forces. And all of this is important because this mirrors Alice's struggles with trust, manipulation, and the harsh realities of her own trauma-filled life. But in regards to the stages of grief, the Carpenter embodies the futility of bargaining. Bargaining comes up during grief as a desperate attempt to regain control over an uncontrollable situation. You try to exercise some control where there is none because you can't handle the helplessness of the situation. You let go of your anger and you try to bargain with God or whomever, hoping that the more diplomatic approach is going to make a difference. It's a natural human response to trauma. When everything feels like it's falling apart, clinging to even the smallest shred of control can be a lifeline. But it doesn't work. Not for us and certainly not for Alice. Wonderland's inhabitants, much like Alice's mind, fail her continuously. The Carpenter abandons his pledge to help, forcing Alice to confront the truth that no one, not even familiar figures of Wonderland, can save her. As a final act, though, the Carpenter redeems himself by throwing himself in front of the Infernal Train when it comes crashing in, allowing Alice to continue her journey and find the caterpillar. In Alice in Wonderland, the caterpillar has always symbolized transformation, and his role in Madness Returns is no different. Alice would return to London, walking over to the house of Radcliffe, the Liddell family's lawyer. His home is filled with Asian objects blending Japanese and Chinese elements. I'm not sure why they couldn't just pick one. Japan and China are two different countries. Alice would walk into Radcliffe's office where she would find her teddy bear, but she would also find Radcliffe. Radcliffe would get defensive and accuse her of being mad, stating that the fire that killed her family started because their cat knocked over the lamp in the library. But he would take it even a step further, accusing Alice of being a pyromaniac, insinuating that Alice started the fire and killed her family.
She's here about the fire again. All the mad child wants to talk about. My report found her family dead by misadventure. She won't accept it. It goes on and on about her killing memories and her need to know the truth. The alleged truth is, the fire began in the library when the cat knocked over a lamp. The blaze trapped her parents and sister upstairs. Sister Lizzie never even unlocked her door. Died in her bed. The guilty cat always sets her off. She denies it, makes no sense, it can't be, etc. Agreed. From the outset, Alice was my candidate for the Pyromaniac. The girl had a fixation with fire. I once remarked that I thought she might have had a larger role in causing the tragedy. She suffered some sort of psychotic episode.
As Alice blacks out and then comes to, she finds herself in a dilapidated version of the house. Stepping outside and walking through the streets of Victorian London, she would see the world in a cataclysmic state as the Infernal Train flies by. Going through the ruinous hellscape of the Vale of Doom, Alice would find the voice of the caterpillar, who would encourage her to let the smoke envelop her as she shrinks and enters the mysterious East.
You are familiar with the saying that smoking stunts your growth?
Adults assault children with that adage. Usually while they've got a pipe stuck in their mouths.
I won't ask you to inhale. Let the smoke envelop you.
As Alice journeys through the mysterious East, the shift in visual style feels deliberate, drawing on the Victorian fascination with Asia, which was often viewed by them as exotic, mysterious, and otherworldly. It's likely that this part of Wonderland was influenced by her interactions with Radcliffe, whose home was filled with those Asian artifacts. This fusion reflects Alice's own imagination, reshaping what she's seen from that house into something as surreal and bizarre as Wonderland itself. Interestingly enough, this could also be a nod to the creator's own infatuation with Asian culture, because American James McGee's wife is Chinese. Perhaps he wanted to dedicate something in his creation to his wife. I get it. I love my wife. Here, the dark realistic tones give way to vibrant, stylized colors as we hear the voiceover of the Cheshire Cat turn introspective. Now, when Alice finally reaches the caterpillar, his words cut to the heart of her struggle.
I've come all this way to find a simulacrum.
If I had the time, I'd detail how often you prefer dealing with illusions rather than the real thing. Problems you refuse to deal with don't exist. You deny reality.
That's not right. I know what's real.
No? Then you allow others to tell you what isn't real. Now, come inside.
I can't help Wonderland if I can't help myself.
Much has changed, but you've got it backwards. Save Wonderland and you may save yourself. The Carpenter was onto something, but he was hiding from the real. Your goal is to accept it.
This perfectly captures the struggle between denial and acceptance. The caterpillar forces Alice to confront her tendency to escape into Wonderland rather than face the painful truths of her past, something she will need to do if she wants to save herself. He also guides her towards the Queen, foreshadowing a very pivotal moment for Alice. The caterpillar represents the voice of reason within Alice's mind, urging her to move beyond the illusions of Wonderland and face the reality of her trauma by facing the Queen of Hearts. It seems that the heart is where the most crucial memory lies, and Alice must get to it before Wonderland falls apart. So, Alice's next stop is Queensland, a place steeped in memories of her first adventure in Wonderland. She quite literally tears through the White King to enter the castle after he warns her to not attempt to fight the executioner. Unrelenting and unstoppable is another manifestation of her deepest guilt and self-hate. All of the skills and strategies that she's relied on thus far can't help her now because these are things you just can't fight or fix with strategy or violence. They will require a different kind of confrontation, one that involves growth and perspective instead of brute force. In the fight, Alice is forced to run away repeatedly, dodging the executioner's attacks while navigating the winding pathways of the Queen's domain. It's not that she doesn't want to fight, because she would much rather prefer a fight. It's just that in her current state, she lacks the emotional strength to face this particular aspect of her psyche head on. Running is all she can do right now because there is a part of her that feels way too small or powerless to take on these colossal feelings of guilt. And so she runs and runs until she reaches the maze and finds a cake. Just the tool she needs. And when she consumes it, she grows, both literally and figuratively. Alice taking a page out of Ant-Man's book is more than just a gameplay mechanic here. We see a moment of symbolic empowerment. By becoming bigger than the executioner, Alice visually and emotionally rises above her guilt and doubt, giving her new perspective so that the executioner, once towering and insurmountable, is now dwarfed by Alice and crushes him with her foot without breaking a sweat. It's so simple. I mean, it's easier said than done, but it's relatively simple, right? And that's why it's so important. It means that once you gain new perspective, once you have this growth mindset, the act of letting go becomes easy. It's the lead up to that moment that is the struggle. By gaining clarity and reclaiming her sense of self, Alice dismantles their power over her, showing that the path to healing isn't about overpowering these emotions, but about growing beyond them. Having finally conquered her guilt and self-loathing, Alice can see clearly now. And she will need this clarity as she comes face to face with the Queen of Hearts, which is her sister, Lizzie. In the first game, the Cheshire Cat told Alice, quote, "You are two parts of the same," referring to the Queen of Hearts. She represented Alice's self-loathing and fractured identity. In Madness Returns, Lizzie's face on the Queen deepens this connection, embodying Alice's guilt and grief over her sister's death. Lizzie has gone from being a sister to an imposing and formidable figure in Wonderland, forcing Alice to confront her memories and look at the world for what it is. And the Queen, / Lizzie, does this by unlocking major portions of Alice's mind, now that she's actually ready to hear it. The question, who benefits from your madness, plunges Alice into a flashback, the most important one. We finally start getting the clarity we've been looking for. But Alice would find herself back in Rutledge Asylum again, reliving the horrors of her institutionalization, straitjacket, lobotomies, and leeches used in cruel treatments. In this hallucination, she sees Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the Tweedles, or the orderly Tweedles, who represent the dehumanizing, brutal nature of the treatment Alice endured at the asylum. Their disjointed banter and unsettling appearances mirror the disorienting and invasive nature of the so-called therapies Alice was subjected to. In her mind, the twins are a manifestation of her feelings of powerlessness and cruelty, how Alice was stripped of her agency and dignity during her time in the asylum. Their banter is nonsensical and dismissive, just like the lack of understanding and empathy Alice experienced from the people who were meant to help her. But there's something else. The truth about the fire. She remembers what she's repressed for years. The fact that she saw a man enter the house just before the fire. You see, at some point, Alice was told that Lizzie locked her door, and so she was trapped. But Alice recalls that Lizzie never locked her door, which means somebody else locked her in, and that Lizzie was probably dead before the fire, and that strange man set the house ablaze to cover his crime. These deeply buried memories, long hidden within her psyche, erupt with unrelenting force, overwhelming Alice and compelling her to face the full weight of her trauma head on. It seems that with every major discovery or trauma, Alice switches worlds. This time, she finds herself in the hallucination of a foggy park. She comes across this mangled, grotesque doll, but before she has time to process the meaning of this encounter, she's once again plunged into Wonderland, but this time into the Dollhouse. And here is where things take a much, much darker turn, bringing us to the fourth stage, depression. The Dollhouse is a nightmare brought to life. The word patchwork doll takes on a whole new meaning here, with dolls that should be comforting looking broken, decayed, and just unsettling. They wander aimlessly, their disjointed movements and eerie smiles acting as symbols for the parts of Alice that have been shattered. And there is one man who fits the description already. Just as the Dollmaker strips the dolls of their remaining humanity, Bumby deprives children of their memories, turning them into blank slates. We just don't know why he's doing this yet. But this horrifying reflection pushes Alice further into her despair. This is depression. The realization that denial, anger, bargaining are futile, and though you have more clarity, that clarity isn't necessarily comforting. If anything, you kind of wish you could go back to any of the earlier stages because, at least in those stages, there is a sliver of hope, however misguided. But depression takes all of that away. Depression signifies surrender, not the kind that leads to peace, but the kind that comes from being utterly drained, exhausted. It's the moment when you stop struggling because you've convinced yourself it doesn't matter. For Alice, it's the point where the pain becomes so unbearable, and she begins to question if she even has the strength to continue. Deep in her psyche, Alice finally finds the answer. It was Dr. Bumby who set the fire to their house. At the time, he wasn't a doctor yet, but he was harboring a twisted obsession with Lizzie. Lizzie was absolutely uncomfortable and did not like him coming around.
Claimed I'd stolen his heart, trifling with his affections, creepy sod, touching me, told Papa to never invite him to tea again.
His so-called love was a sick, demented, vile fixation on somebody far too young to be the object of anyone's desires. You can finally see how the controversy of the real world, Lewis Carroll, the author, controller of Wonderland, seeps into this mirror world. When Lizzie, a child, rejected his advances, his sick and selfish rage consumed him, and he entered her room, locking the door, and did unimaginable things.
My Lizzie, what is this train's destination?
Madness and destruction. You shouldn't ask questions you know the answer to. It's not polite. And that noise wasn't Lizzie talking in her sleep.
Oh, no! Oh, poor Lizzie!
And there are no centaurs in Oxford. Make your survival mean something, or we are all doomed!
Despite being gaslit into believing that Lizzie had her door locked, and as a result was trapped in her room during the fire, Alice would remember that Lizzie hated locked rooms. Bumby destroyed Lizzie, and by extension, Alice. This horrifying revelation kicks Alice into full gear, and things in Wonderland start to make sense. And now, the source of the corruption of Wonderland finally gets a face. The face of Dr. Bumby, or a corrupted, warped, twisted version of it anyway. And now we understand why Black Sludge has been invading Wonderland, because it turns out that black ooze is a representation for the bile that Bumby spits, the words sliming his way into Alice's mind as he tried to make her forget what he did.
Am I not the most wretched and selfish of fortune's fools? Oblivious, I live in a training ground for prostitutes. My mentor is an abuser and purveyor. I've been complicit with my sister's murderer and the killer of my family as he corrupted my mind. I sought relief from my pain and you turned me away from the truth.
You are almost there, almost free from what you fear. You could have been cured. You could have forgotten.
Abandon the memory of my family.
They are dead, and you should be too.
You misbegotten abomination! Murderer! You blood-sucking parasite! The damage you've done to children! The abuse!
I provide a service. In the great and awful metropolis, appetites of all sorts must be gratified.
My family! My mind! The infernal train!
The train is your invention, your defense. I merely set its schedule and itinerary. The train is coming with its shiny cars, with comfy seats, and wheels of stars. So hush, my little ones, have no fear. The man in the moon is the engineer.
I'll stop that train, if it's the last thing I do.
As you wish.
It's unclear what service Bumby or the Dollmaker is talking about even now, but it doesn't sound good. The Dollmaker turns Alice into a doll, but with a burst of energy she manages to break free. What follows is a constant switch-up between Alice's confrontation with Bumby and her navigating a new realm in Wonderland, the Infernal Train.
You corrupted my memories, but you failed to make me forget.
I could have made you into a tasty bit. Clients out the door waiting for a piece from a raving, delusional beauty with no memory of the past or no sense of the future. But you wouldn't forget. You insisted on holding on to your fantasies. You're mad, like your sister.
Don't speak of her. You didn't know her.
Your sister was a tease, pretended to despise me. She got what she wanted in the end.
Information tumbles out bits at a time. All of it is traumatic and terrifying for Alice's young sensibilities. Yet, it's crucial for her to power through this and fix Wonderland. Dr. Bumby has been using the Houndsditch home as a cover to prey on vulnerable children, erasing their memories using hypnosis and leaving them trapped in a state of detachment from reality. And in their dissociation, these children are turned into mindless sex slaves, or perfect products, as Bumby likes to call them. From the start, hypnosis is central to Dr. Bumby's practice, but it quickly becomes clear that he wields it not as a tool for healing, but as a means to keep children submissive and under his control. Now, in real life, ethically, hypnosis can be a powerful tool in trauma recovery. When used responsibly, by a trained professional, it can help people access repressed memories, process unresolved emotions, and alleviate symptoms of PTSD. However, it relies on trust and care to ensure it fosters healing. In the wrong hands, as with Bumby, hypnosis becomes a weapon. Instead of guiding recovery, it can be twisted to suppress autonomy, erase truths, and manipulate the vulnerable. Bumby's goal isn't to heal, it's to strip children of their identities and reduce them to blank slates, primed for exploitation by the buyers he supplies. In Bumby's distorted worldview, this isn't just acceptable, it's an opportunity. He doesn't see the destruction he causes, he only cares about the profit it brings. So the objective now is finally clear. Eliminate the Dollmaker, get rid of the corruption once and for all. A battle ensues, with Alice throwing everything she's got at this malevolent, creepy, mangled figure. It takes place in the Infernal Train, which so far has symbolized Alice's unresolved trauma, her thoughts, her repressed memories, a relentless force threatening to destroy her identity. This train, it's been a manifestation loaded up with Alice's self-destruction, her inner chaos, guilt, pain, but also, namely, Bumby's corruption. Battling the Dollmaker in this location brings it all full circle, getting Alice back on track. With her having gone through 4 stages of grief, she now has new perspective. And this is the final stage of grief, acceptance. Alice has accepted her situation, and with that comes the clarity and confidence to face your fears and grief head on. And that's exactly what she does. During this showdown, the Dollmaker uses his hands to taunt Alice as children sometimes do, and at times gropes and shakes her, most likely referencing how the children are treated once their minds are wiped clean. And when she finally kills him, there is a release. Alice steps back into reality and confronts Bumby at the Moorgate train station, but it's her word against his. Alice already has a reputation as a mad child and a troublemaker. Dr. Bumby, on the other hand, is an upstanding citizen, a doctor running a home for orphans. Which one is London more likely going to believe? Alice realizes this too, and so she pushes him into the path of an oncoming train, ending his reign of terror once and for all. And now both Wonderland and London are free of the oozing sore of depravity. After she kills Bumby, Alice exits the train station and comes to the surface to find something extraordinary. We see now that London and Wonderland have blurred together into Londerland. This new reality isn't dark or fragmented. It's a blend of both worlds, a symbolic representation of Alice's reintegration into the real world. The place that was once a chaotic refuge is now healed and connected with reality. It's not perfect, but at least it's safe. The Cheshire Cat's monologue explains that Wonderland, though scarred and damaged, is intact for the time being. Cheshire Cat's words remind Alice, and by extension we the players, that healing doesn't mean everything is magically fixed. The scars remain, but they're proof of your survival, evidence of now being harder, better, faster, stronger. Alice's rebuilt life is represented by Londerland, a seamless integration of her inner and outer world. So even if she is carrying the weight of her past, at least she's doing it on her terms. Now, when I look at Alice's story in American McGee's Alice and Madness Returns, I don't think she has schizophrenia in a clinical sense, even though some of what she experiences, like the vivid hallucinations of Wonderland or her fragmented sense of reality, might make it seem that way at first glance. Those are schizoaffective symptoms. But to me, her struggles feel more like the effects of deep trauma rather than a psychiatric condition like schizophrenia. After all, she survived the fire that killed her family, and everything she experiences seems tied to the grief and guilt that she carries from that. To understand why Alice's experiences don't align with schizophrenia, it helps to look at what schizophrenia actually involves. People with schizophrenia often experience symptoms that fall into 3 main categories: positive, negative, and cognitive. Positive symptoms include hallucinations, which can involve seeing or hearing things that aren't there, like voices commenting on their behavior or commanding them to act. Imagine if you had a devil over your shoulder talking to you. These hallucinations feel real and intrusive, and the person may believe that they come from an external source. Delusions, another positive symptom, are fixed, false beliefs that don't align with reality, such as believing someone is out to harm them or that they possess special powers. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, involve a loss of normal functions, such as showing little emotions, withdrawing socially, or losing interest in activities. Cognitive symptoms affect memory, attention, and decision-making, often making it difficult to think clearly or follow through on tasks. Even though Alice does experience hallucination-like visions in the form of Wonderland, the context and the nature of these visions are starkly different. Wonderland isn't something that Alice believes is literally real. Instead, it functions as a dissociative state, a mental refuge where her mind symbolically works through her trauma. For somebody with schizophrenia, hallucinations are often more disorganized and lack the kind of internal logic that Alice's Wonderland has. Wonderland is chaotic, but it's deeply grounded in Alice's experiences and emotions. The Queen of Heart embodies her guilt, the Cheshire Cat represents her inner wisdom, and the Infernal Train symbolizes her suppressed memories. Those are just some examples. The Mad Hatter does seem to have bipolar disorder, though. Nevertheless, these are not random or meaningless. They're purposefully reflective of her struggles. Similarly, Alice doesn't exhibit the delusions typical of schizophrenia. While she does believe that somebody is out there trying to gain control of her or trying to get her, she doesn't believe that she's actually currently being actively controlled or persecuted, nor does she display the kind of disconnected, paranoid thinking that's often associated with the condition. Instead, her journey is founded in her attempts to understand herself and confront her past, even though her mind shatters under the weight of her trauma. Wonderland isn't just some random delusion or hallucination, it's a reflection of her mind, a place where she processes all the pain that she can't deal with in the real world. That's what Wonderland is for her. It's chaotic and surreal, but it's also symbolic. Each character, each setting represents some part of her struggle. If it's guilt, anger, or loss, it's her way of working through things that feel impossible to face explicitly or directly. Some people might point out that Wonderland is a hallucination in and of itself, that might be schizophrenia, but I think it's different because in this case, Alice knows on some level that this world is a part of her. She doesn't fully believe Wonderland is real, she knows it's not real. Instead, she uses it as a way to explore her fractured memories and try to make sense of what had happened to her. This points to Alice more than likely having a dissociative disorder or state brought on by trauma, where her mind splits off into this other world to cope with everything that she's been through, more so than it is schizophrenia. So while her journey can look like psychosis, the line between trauma-induced dissociation and psychosis can actually blur, especially in characters whose realities are profoundly altered by their mental state. Just like in an alternate universe Russia with Indika, the nun marked by religious horror, whose experiences are more closely aligned with schizophrenia, visual and auditory hallucinations where someone is talking to her, delusions and disorganized thinking. Unlike Alice, who remains on some level aware that Wonderland is a creation of her own mind, Indika's journey explores the reality of fractured psychosis. Click the next video to dive into that psychoanalysis.